He built empires with steel and stone, but couldn't quiet the cries of his motherless child. Then, one night, the widowed millionaire walked in and saw the nanny breastfeeding his baby. Was it betrayal, or the only miracle that could save them both? What he did next changed everything forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. Ethan Blackwell had once been a man carved from granite, unshakable in every boardroom, his word enough to silence entire corporations. Yet inside the grand halls of his mansion, filled with the echoes of marble and cold chandeliers, his fortress had crumbled. His wife, Eliza, had died giving birth to their daughter, Grace, leaving him with a nursery full of soft blankets and no warmth to fill them. The empire he built seemed worthless compared to the helpless cries of the tiny girl he could not soothe. Grace was fragile, her little body racked by colic and grief that seemed inherited. No bottle could quiet her, no rocking cradle gave peace. Ethan had hired the best nannies money could buy, women with glowing resumes and experience with difficult children, but none lasted longer than a week. His temper was sharp, his grief sharper, and the endless wails of his daughter had turned the mansion into a prison of sleepless nights. One by one, the nannies left, whispering that no heart could endure the Blackwell house, no soul could tame the cries that came from Grace's cradle. On a rain-soaked morning, when Ethan had just dismissed yet another nanny who packed her bags in tears, Clara Morales stepped through the towering ironed gates. She had no resume worth mentioning, no refined education, her clothes were plain, her shoes worn, but she carried something none of the others had brought, an unshakable gentleness in her eyes and a quiet strength born from years of caring for her younger siblings, in a crowd of laundry soap and frying onions. She was not looking for riches, she was looking for purpose, and the ad for a nanny in the Blackwell estate had caught her eye like fate itself. The butler looked her over skeptically when she arrived, dripping rain from her umbrella onto the marble floors. "You'll not last long," he muttered, shaking his head. "The master is cold, the child is inconsolable. No one stays." Clara simply smiled softly, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. "Then, let me be the first." When Ethan met her in his study, he barely looked up from the files spread across his desk. His eyes, still gray and hollow with loss, flickered over her for less than a second. "You've heard the warnings," he said, his voice like ice. "My daughter cries day and night. My patience is thin. If you cannot handle it, leave now before wasting both our time." Clara met his coldness with steady resolve. "I don't scare easy," she said gently. "Every cry means something. She just needs someone to listen." For the first time in months, Ethan hesitated. He wanted to laugh at her naive confidence, yet something in her calm tone pressed against his grief like a balm. Against his own instincts, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. The nursery is upstairs. Do your job." The first hours tested every ounce of Clara's strength. Grace wailed from her cradle, her tiny fists clenched, her face red with exhaustion. The bottle lay abandoned, the formula untouched. Clara lifted her into her arms, humming softly, the same lullabies she once sang to her baby brother in the dark nights when her mother worked double shifts. Grace's cries softened, just slightly, enough to keep Clara rocking her, whispering soothing words, pressing kisses to the crown of her tiny head. For the first time, the child's sobs quieted to hiccups, and her little body sagged into Clara's chest. From the doorway, Ethan stood, unseen, his tall frame hidden in shadow. His jaw tightened as he watched the stranger cradle his daughter with a tenderness that neither bottles nor medicine had achieved. Something twisted in his chest, jealousy, awe, longing, but he turned away before Clara could notice. His heart was not ready to feel. Days passed, and Clara poured herself into the role as though Grace were her own flesh and blood. She sang while folding the baby's clothes, traced circles on her tiny back during restless nights, and carried her through the vast hallways with patience unbroken by exhaustion. Ethan remained distant, watching with suspicion, waiting for the inevitable moment she would break like the others. But Clara did not break. Late one night, when the moon spilled silver light through the nursery windows, Grace's cries rang louder than ever. She refused the bottle, pushing it away with furious sobs. Clara tried rocking, tried singing, tried every trick she knew, but nothing soothed her. Tears filled her own eyes at the sound of the baby's pain. And then, without thinking, driven by instinct deeper than reason, Clara pulled Grace to her chest and allowed the child to nurse. The room fell silent. Grace's sobs stilled as her tiny mouth latched, her small body relaxing into Clara's arms. The storm of grief that had haunted the nursery finally lifted, replaced by peace so pure that Clara's own tears spilled silently down her cheeks. At that very moment, Ethan opened the door. He froze, his entire body rigid, as his eyes took in the sight. Clara, her face pale but serene, cradling his daughter against her breast. His mouth went dry, his chest heaving with shock. For a man who built fortunes on control, this was chaos beyond imagination. His wife was gone, his child had never found comfort until now, with another woman. "Clara," his voice thundered, breaking the fragile quiet of the nursery. She gasped, clutching Grace protectively, her heart racing as she turned to face him. His eyes were wide, his expression a storm of anger, confusion, and something she could not name. Clara's throat went dry, but she didn't flinch. Grace was finally calm, finally breathing in peace, and Clara's protective instincts outweighed her fear of the powerful man glaring at her. "She wouldn't stop crying," Clara whispered. "I couldn't bear it. I had to try something." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, the fury in his face carved sharp as stone. "You?" His voice broke, lowering to a harsh whisper. "Do you know what you've done?" Clara's eyes filled, but her arms did not loosen around the baby. "I gave her what she needed, that's all." The silence stretched, heavy with 1,000 unspoken truths. Ethan wanted to order her out, to tear her from the nursery, to end this madness before it unspooled further. Yet, in the stillness, his eyes fell on Grace's face, finally at rest, her lips softly moving, her small body soothed for the first time in memory. The storm in his chest faltered. He swallowed hard, his voice rough with something Clara couldn't quite place. "Leave her crib when she's asleep. We'll talk in the morning." Clara nodded, though her heart raced. She expected him to fire her, to cast her out by dawn. Yet she stayed, humming softly, until Grace drifted into slumber, her little fingers curled around Clara's dress. When Clara finally placed Grace gently in the crib, she turned to leave the room and found Ethan still standing there, his eyes shadowed. He didn't speak, only watched her walk past him, his silence heavier than any words. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with tension. Ethan didn't appear at breakfast, though Clara noticed the way the butler eyed her with curiosity, as if already sensing whispers of a scandal. Clara forced herself to move with calm determination, feeding Grace, folding blankets, keeping the nursery in perfect order, though her hands trembled every time she thought of the moment Ethan had caught her. Hours later, he summoned her to his study. The air was thick with polished wood, bookshelves lined with untold wealth, and a silence that pressed against her ribs. Ethan stood by the window, his back to her, his hand clenched on the frame. "You crossed a line," he said finally, his voice low but unyielding. Clara lowered her gaze, bracing herself. "I know, but if you saw her face, you know why I did it." He turned sharply, his eyes flashing with something between rage and vulnerability. "You think I don't know what my daughter needs? You think I haven't tried everything? Do you think I haven't lain awake every night, hearing her cries and feeling powerless?" His voice broke, the cracks of grief raw. "And then you, a stranger, walk in and succeed where I failed." Clara's eyes stung with tears, but she stood firm. "I don't think you've failed. You're grieving. She is grieving too. Sometimes, what a child needs isn't medicine or money. It's a heartbeat. It's warmth." For a long moment, Ethan just stared at her, his chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. The walls he built around himself trembled, but he forced them higher. "You will never do it again," he said, his tone sharp, as if binding the command to stone. Clara bowed her head, though her heart ached. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwell." But when she left his study, she knew something had changed. He had seen the truth, even if he would not admit it. Grace had found peace in her arms, and no matter how hard Ethan tried to bury it, he could not erase what he had witnessed. That night, As Clara sang softly to the baby, under the silver glow of the moon, she felt the mansion itself begin to shift. The cries no longer filled every corner, the shadows seemed less suffocating, and though Ethan lingered in his grief, a seed had been planted in the silence, a seed that would grow into something neither of them could yet name. The door creaked as Ethan Blackwell stepped into the nursery, his tall frame outlined against the dim light spilling in from the hallway. For a moment, he thought his weary mind was playing tricks on him. Then his gaze sharpened, and his heart stopped. Clara Morales sat in the rocking chair, cradling Grace in her arms. The baby, his daughter who had wailed through endless nights, was nestled at her breast, drinking hungrily in complete silence. The sight ignited a storm inside him. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the grief he carried sharpening into something that felt like betrayal. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice cracked through the room like thunder, low but vibrating with fury. Clara froze. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she instinctively pulled the blanket higher over Grace, shielding the infant, as though protection could undo what he had just witnessed. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to look at him. She wouldn't stop crying. She wouldn't take the bottle. "I had to." "You had to?" Ethan stepped forward, his eyes cold steel, jaw tight with rage. "You crossed a line that no one had the right to cross. Do you think because you're the nanny you can play mother? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Clara flinched at his words but did not put Grace down. The baby's tiny hands rested peacefully against her chest, breath soft, finally content after weeks of torment. Clara's voice quivered, but she did not back down. "She was starving, Mr. Blackwell. I couldn't stand by while she screamed herself raw, while she suffered. I couldn't." Ethan's anger warred with the truth of what he saw. For the first time in weeks, his daughter was silent, sleeping, safe. His heart cracked at the sight, but his pride roared louder. "You should have called me. You should have found another way." "We worked another way," Clara whispered, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I've tried everything. Warm bottles, cool bottles, different formulas, gentle rocking, even singing until my throat went raw. She refused them all. She was wasting away in my arms, and tonight, I couldn't let her go one more hour. I did what I had to so she could rest, so she could live." The words cut him. Ethan's throat tightened, but he fought to keep his expression hard. Memories clawed at him. The hospital room, his wife's pale face, her fingers slipping from his grip as Grace wailed for the first time. He had sworn never to let anyone blur the sacred line of who she was, who her mother had been. And yet here was this woman, this stranger, holding his daughter as though she belonged to her. "You're finished here," he said, his voice sharp, final. "Pack your things and get out by morning." The blow hit Clara like a physical strike, her chest hollowing with despair. Still, she didn't move. She couldn't. Not while Grace slept so peacefully in her arms. "Please," she breathed, desperation giving her voice strength. "Don't send me away. Not like this. Look at her, Mr. Blackwell. Look at your daughter. She's resting. She's safe. When was the last time you saw her like this?" Ethan's gaze flickered unwillingly to Grace. The tiny girl's cheeks were finally full with breath, no longer streaked with tears. Her little fists unclenched, her lips relaxed against Clara's warmth. His chest ached, and for a flicker of a moment the ice around him began to crack. But grief was a cruel master. He tore his eyes away and growled, "You think this excuses what you've done? You think because she's quiet now that I can forget the boundary you've crossed?" Clara's arms tightened around Grace protectively, though her voice trembled. "No, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I'm begging you, don't punish her for my mistake. If you fire me, who will hold her when she cries like this tomorrow? Who will soothe her when the bottle fails again? Will you?" The words pierced him deeper than he wanted to admit. Shame stirred in his chest, shame and the weight of truth. He had tried in those early weeks. He had paced the halls until dawn, had cradled Grace with hands that shook from exhaustion, but she had never quieted for him. His daughter screamed until his ears rang, until hopelessness drowned him. He had withdrawn, buried himself in work, in silence, leaving her in the care of strangers. Clara's eyes searched his, pleading, "I promise you, I'll follow every rule. I'll never cross that line again. Just let me help her. Please." Ethan's breath came ragged, his chest rising and falling, as if he had run miles. For the first time in years, he felt cornered, not by a boardroom rival, but by his own heart. The sight of his daughter, so still, so peaceful, tore at him. Could he really rip this comfort from her? His jaw flecked, his voice low, unsteady. "You don't understand. Every time I see someone holding her, every time she cries and I can't stop it, I hear my wife's last words. I see her lying there, slipping away. I failed her, and now—" He stopped, swallowing hard, the words clawing at his throat. "Now you come in here and act like you can replace her, like you can replace the only woman who ever—" His voice broke and he turned sharply, hiding the rawness in his eyes. Clara's own tears spilled then, soft and silent. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said gently. "I could never. Grace doesn't need another mother. She needs someone who won't give up on her, who will hold her even when the world says she's too difficult. That's all I'm trying to be." The room hung in silence, broken only by Grace's steady breathing. Ethan stood rigid, torn between fury and the undeniable truth that weighed on him like chains. He could fire her. He could call another nanny, cycle through another stranger who would last a week before fleeing. But none of them had quieted Grace. None of them had fought this hard for her. At last his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "One more chance," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "You stay, but you obey my rules. You step out of line again, and you're gone. Do you understand?" Clara nodded quickly, relief washing over her like a flood. "Yes, sir, I understand. Thank you. You won't regret this, I promise." Ethan's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, unreadable, then drifted to Grace. The sight of her tiny chest rising and falling in peace felt like a miracle he hadn't known he needed. He turned and left the room, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving Clara clutching Grace with trembling arms, whispering silent prayers that she could live up to her promise. Clara remained in the rocking chair long after Ethan's footsteps had faded into the silence of the ground house. Her body still shook from the confrontation, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest like a stone. Yet Grace's small breaths, steady and calm, anchored her. She smoothed the hand over the baby's downy hair, whispering softly, as much to herself as to the child, "We made it through. Somehow, we made it through." But the promise she had given Ethan echoed in her head. One more chance. It wasn't just her job on the line. It was Grace's fragile well-being, and perhaps even Ethan's hidden heart, though she didn't dare dwell on that thought. She had seen the flicker in his eyes when he looked at Grace resting against her. That brokenness, that desperate longing, he buried beneath steel and control. It haunted her as much as his anger. The next morning, Ethan avoided her. He left the mansion early, his driver whisking him away before Clara could catch his eye. She didn't know if it was deliberate or if he truly had business that demanded his attention. Still, the distance was a reprieve. It gave her time to steady her resolve. She would do exactly as she promised, respect Grace at all costs. The days stretched on quietly. Grace fussed here and there, but Clara had discovered something remarkable. After the intimacy of the night before, the infant seemed to trust her more deeply. Her crying spells didn't last as long, and when they came, Clara's touch, her humming, seemed enough to soothe her. She didn't dare cross that forbidden line again, but she still offered the baby everything she could: warmth, patience, and love. By evening, Ethan returned. Clara felt his presence before she saw him. The mansion seemed to shift when he entered, as though the air tightened around his frame. He strode through the hall with the commanding energy of a man used to control, but when he paused outside the nursery door, his steps faltered. Clara caught the shadow of hesitation in his posture before he entered. Grace was lying in her crib, wide awake, her big eyes fixed on Clara's face as she sang a lullaby in hushed tones. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching silently. Clara didn't notice him at first. She was lost in the rhythm of her song, her hand lightly stroking Grace's tiny arm. The baby cooed softly, a sound that sent a rush of pride and tenderness through Clara's chest. When Clara finally looked up, her voice faltered. Ethan's gaze was fixed on her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan stepped into the room, his presence— "She looks different," he said slowly, his tone carrying both disbelief and caution. "She looks calmer." Clara straightened, nerves fluttering. "She's still fragile, but she's responding better today. I think—" She hesitated, afraid her words might come across as boastful. "I think she just needed consistency, someone to stay." His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat she thought he might snap again. But instead, he glanced at Grace and sighed, weary lines deepening around his eyes. "You don't understand. Every nanny before you claimed they could handle it. They promised me the same thing, and every one of them failed within days. You shouldn't think you're any different." Clara swallowed, but her voice steadied. "Maybe I'm not different, Mr. Blackwell. Maybe I'll fail too. But until then, I won't give up on her. That's all I can promise." The sincerity in her tone hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He looked away, muttering something under his breath, and moved toward the crib. Grace's gaze shifted instantly to him, her tiny mouth forming an O of curiosity. Ethan reached out, his hand hovering above her as if afraid she would vanish at his touch. Clara watched him, sensing the vulnerability beneath his stoic facade. "She has your eyes," Clara said softly, surprising herself. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan froze, then finally looked at her. His voice was low, almost broken. Her mother used to say that too. She'd laugh and say, "Grace would trap me with these eyes, the way she had." Now, he stopped, his throat working. "Now I can't even look at them without remembering the price I paid for them." Clara's heart squeezed at his confession. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that Grace wasn't just a reminder of loss, but also a living piece of love, of possibility. But she knew better than to speak that aloud. He wasn't ready to hear it, not yet. Instead, she said gently, "Grace doesn't just need to survive, Mr. Blackwell. She needs you. She needs her father." The words struck him like a blade. He clenched his jaw, turned sharply, and strode out of the room without another word. Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging. She had spoken the truth, but she wasn't sure if he would ever let himself believe it. That night, as the mansion settled into silence, Clara tucked Grace against her shoulder and whispered a vow. "No matter what he decides, I won't give up on you. I'll stay until you're strong enough, until you know you're loved." That's a promise. But even as she whispered those words, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan's haunted eyes. The anger he wielded like armor couldn't hide the raw grief underneath. And Clara knew, deep in her bones, that as much as Grace needed her, Ethan did too, even if he would never admit it. The following days blurred together in fragile balance. Ethan kept his distance, watching from the edges but rarely interfering. Clara honored her promise, careful not to cross his boundaries again. She fed Grace from bottles, soothed her with patience, and filled the nursery with quiet lullabies. Slowly, undeniably, Grace began to change. Her cries grew less piercing, her sleep stretches longer. She even rewarded Clara with her first fleeting smile, a crooked little grin that melted every piece of Clara's heart. Clara laughed through tears, holding Grace close, whispering, "You're stronger than anyone knows, little one." Ethan saw it all. He would linger by the doorway at odd hours, never stepping in, but his eyes betrayed him. Clara caught him once, late at night, standing in the shadows as Grace slept soundly in her crib. He didn't notice Clara watching him, his expression softening as though he was rediscovering his daughter for the first time. Still, pride kept his words sharp when he did speak. He reminded Clara of her place, of the rules, as though clinging to them kept him safe from the tenderness creeping into his chest. And Clara, though she bristled sometimes, accepted it. She knew his commands were not cruelty, but fear in disguise. The turning point came one stormy night. Grace awoke in the small hours, wailing against the thunder. Clara rushed to her side, gathering the trembling baby in her arms. She rocked her, sang to her, whispered soothing words. But this time, nothing seemed to work. The storm outside raged too fiercely, each crash of thunder undoing Clara's efforts. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale in the dim lightning glow. Clara turned to him, her voice desperate. "She needs you." He froze. "She doesn't want me. She never does." Clara shook her head, holding Grace tightly. "That's not true. She just doesn't know you yet, but she will, if you let her. Please, Mr. Blackwell, for her." The plea hung in the charged air. Ethan's chest rose and fell, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles whitened. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. Clara carefully transferred Grace into his arms, guiding his hands to support her tiny body. Grace whimpered, But then something miraculous happened. She stilled, her sobs softening as she gazed up at him with wide, tear-bright eyes. Ethan froze, looking down at his daughter as though seeing her for the first time. His breath caught, and in that fragile silence, Clara saw the fortress around his heart crack open. Neither spoke. There were no words for the moment. Only the storm outside, the hush within, and the tiny heartbeat binding them all together. For Ethan, it was the beginning of something he had not dared to hope for. For Clara, it was proof that her plea had reached him. And for Grace, it was the first taste of the bond she had been waiting for all along. The mansion settled into a rhythm that Clara had not expected to find so soon. In the first days after her confrontation with Ethan, she thought the weight of his threats would crush her resolve. But instead, they became the iron frame around which she built her determination. She clung to Grace's every breath, every sound, every fragile expression, as if the baby's survival depended not only on bottles and sleep, but on the steady beat of a human heart beside her. Each morning, Clara woke before the sun. She slipped into the nursery, her steps soft against the polished floor. Grace would already be stirring, her tiny fists waving as though she were fighting invisible battles in her sleep. Clara leaned over the crib, whispering, "Good morning, little one," and in return Grace would let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a squeak. It was a ritual now, those first few minutes of quiet connection before the mansion's routines intruded. Feeding times became calmer, no longer marathons of tears and panic. Clara learned the rhythm of the bottle, tilting it just so, pausing to let Grace rest, patting her back until the softest burp broke through. Bath times, once fraught with flailing limbs, now became a game of soothing splashes and gentle songs. And sleep, precious, elusive sleep, began to lengthen into hours instead of minutes. The crib no longer a battlefield but a haven. Through it all, Ethan watched. At first, he stood in the shadows of door frames, silent and rigid, his eyes darting between Clara and his daughter as though searching for proof of betrayal. But as days turned to weeks, he began to linger longer. Clara would catch glimpses of him at unexpected moments, his tall figure half hidden by the doorway, his gaze locked on Grace's face as though afraid to look too long and yet unable to turn away. Wondered once, Clara heard a sound that made her heart stutter. Ethan chuckling under his breath when Grace startled herself with a sneeze. It was faint, almost a ghost of laughter, but it was real. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't dare break the spell. She pretended she hadn't heard, though the sound replayed in her mind long after he had walked away. Still, the divide between their worlds remained as stark as ever. Clara was the nanny, the hired help, a shadow in the halls of wealth. That divide was clearest at mealtimes. The grand dining hall stretched like a cathedral, its polished table gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his sisters sometimes visiting, his business associates gathering for stiff conversations that echoed against the high ceilings. Clara, meanwhile, ate in the kitchen. Alone, her plate balanced on the small wooden table near the back door, she ate quickly, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from beyond the heavy doors. Sometimes the cook would join her for a few minutes, exchanging a kind word or a quiet sigh about the household's strictness. But most evenings, Clara ate in silence, her thoughts dwelling on the little girl sleeping upstairs, and the father who seemed to prefer walls over windows. One evening, after finishing her simple meal, Clara lingered by the kitchen window. The mansion's garden lay beyond, a spread of roses and ivy lit by lanterns. She could hear faint strains of music from the hall, Ethan entertaining guests, his deep voice carrying even at a distance. She imagined him at the head of the table, sharp suit, glass of wine in hand, every word measured and controlled. And then she imagined him as she had seen him in the nursery, hesitant, fragile, almost. The contrast tugged at her heart, leaving her unsettled. Her opportunity to glimpse more of his hidden self came unexpectedly. It was past midnight, the house hushed. The storm of social gatherings finally subsided. Clara walked softly down the hall, intending to fetch a blanket from the linen closet. As she passed the study, she noticed the door ajar, golden light spilling through the crack. Curiosity tugged at her. She shouldn't intrude, she told herself. Yet her steps slowed, and before she knew it, she stood at the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan sat behind the large oak desk, a glass of untouched brandy beside him. His jacket was off, his tie loosened, his posture bent forward as though the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders. On the wall above the fireplace hung a portrait Clara had never noticed before. A woman, with delicate features, eyes bright with laughter, gazed out from the canvas. She looked so alive it was as though she might step down from the frame. Clara realized with a jolt that this must be Grace's mother, Ethan's late wife. Ethan rose, crossing the room to stand before the portrait. His voice, low and raw, carried across the room, though he didn't know Clara was there. "I promised you, Evelyn. I promised I would protect her, that she would never suffer, but she cries for hours, she trembles at shadows, and I can't reach her. I can't be what she needs." His hand trembled as he reached toward the portrait, not quite touching it, if you say that. "You should be here, not me. You knew how to hold her, how to calm her. I only remind her of what she's lost." Clara's chest ached at the grief in his tone. She wanted to step inside, to tell him he wasn't failing, that Grace needed him more than he could see. But this was not her moment to claim. This was his private confession, a glimpse into the pain he carried when no one was watching. Ethan lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to love her without breaking apart." Clara turned away, retreating down the hall before her presence could betray him. Her heart raced, her eyes stung with unshed tears. She had come to this mansion to care for a child, but now she understood that it was not just Grace who needed saving. Ethan, too, was trapped by grief, by guilt, by promises he could not let go. That night, as she lay in her small room, Clara whispered into the darkness, "I'll bring back the light for Grace. For him? Somehow." Her vow was silent, unseen, but it carried the weight of certainty. She would not only nurse the baby back to health, but also find a way to pierce the walls Ethan had built. Perhaps she could never tear them down completely, but she could at least offer a window, one that let light and warmth back into the mansion that had long forgotten both. The following days carried new weight. Clara's routines with Grace grew stronger, more confident. Each smile, each coo, each small milestone felt like a victory, not just for the baby, but for Ethan too, though he didn't yet realize it. And each time she caught him watching from the shadows, she would not give up. Not on Grace, not on Ethan, not on the light she believed still lingered behind those walls. The days blended into one another, yet Clara felt the mansion changing, subtly, like a house that had long been shuttered beginning to breathe again. Grace's cries grew less frantic, replaced more often by the bubbling coos of a child testing her voice. The air of despair that had once lingered in the nursery seemed to lift, replaced by something softer. Clara embraced the routine, though it was not glamorous. Her hands grew rough from washing bottles, her back ached from pacing the floor at odd hours, yet she carried herself with a quiet pride. The little girl in her arms was more than a duty, she was a reason. Still, Ethan's presence remained a constant puzzle. He drifted in and out of rooms, his expression guarded, his voice clipped. He issued instructions to the staff with precision, never raising his tone, but never inviting conversation either. Yet when it came to Grace, something shifted. Clara noticed how his hand lingered on the edge of the crib, how his eyes softened, though his mouth never admitted what his gaze betrayed. There were evenings when Clara thought he might speak to her. He would linger in the nursery doorway after returning from late meetings, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Clara would rock Grace in her arms, humming softly, and for a moment Ethan seemed on the edge of words. But then he would clear his throat, nod stiffly, and retreat down the hall, leaving the silence heavier than before. The distance between them was never clearer than at dinner time. Clara sat in the kitchen with her plain plate of stew or bread, while in the grand hall beyond, laughter rose and fell like waves. She could hear the murmur of voices, the clatter of silverware against china, the low hum of Ethan commanding a room. It was another world, separated not by walls, but by rules. She was staff, he was master. Once, though, she caught a glimpse that unsettled her. She had gone to the dining hall to return a tray, and through the half-open doors, she saw Ethan at the head of the table, glass in hand, his smile sharp but hollow. The guests laughed at something he said, their eyes shining with admiration, but Ethan's gaze flicked toward the empty chair beside him, his hand tightened on the stem of his glass, and for a heartbeat, Clara swore he looked lost. She slipped away before he could see her. But the image lingered, haunting her even as she returned to the quiet kitchen. It was not power that weighed on Ethan. It was absence. One night, that absence became undeniable. Clara had risen to fetch more blankets for Grace when she again passed the study. The light was on, the door slightly open. She told herself she shouldn't intrude, but her feet betrayed her. Ethan sat at his desk, shoulders bowed, the fire casting shadows across his face. The portrait of his late wife hung above the mantel, her painted eyes glowing in the light. Ethan stared at it as if waiting for her to speak. "You'd know what to do," he whispered, his voice raw. "You always did." She cries, and God, I can't make it stop. I don't know how to reach her without breaking myself open. She looks at me and I see you, and I can't. His voice cracked, and he pressed a trembling hand to his. Clara froze in the hall, her throat tight. She had never seen him so undone, so stripped of the armor he wore before the world. He was a man grieving, not just a wife, but the version of himself that had existed with her. Ethan lowered his hand, his eyes fixed on the portrait. "I promised you, Evelyn. I said I'd protect her. But I'm failing, and I can't let anyone close enough to see." Clara retreated before her presence could wound his pride. But as she walked back to her small room, her mind burned with a new clarity. Ethan was not cruel by nature. He was terrified. His rules, his coldness, his sharp words were shields, forged to keep grief from drowning him. Lying in bed that night, Clara whispered into the dark, "I'll find a way. For Grace, for him." From then on, her care for Grace carried a new weight. She knew that every smile she coaxed from the baby was a thread pulling Ethan closer to life. Every peaceful night's sleep was proof that the mansion could hold warmth again. She would not confront him directly, she would not expose his vulnerability, but she would keep offering light until he could not ignore it. Her resolve deepened one evening when Ethan came to the nursery earlier than usual. Grace had just finished feeding, her head resting against Clara's shoulder, her tiny breath warm against Clara's neck. Ethan stopped at the door, his gaze fixed on the sight. "She's calm," he said, his voice uncertain, almost disbelieving. Clara nodded. "She's learning to trust the world again." His jaw tightened. "Or learning to trust you." Clara met his eyes, steady. "Trust is all she needs, Mr. Sterling, from anyone who can give it." Something flickered in his expression. Anger, perhaps, or recognition. He stepped forward, reached for Grace, then hesitated. For a moment, Clara thought he might retreat, but instead, he held out his arms. Clara gently transferred Grace into his grasp. He held her stiffly at first, as if afraid she might shatter. Grace whimpered, and Ethan's breath caught, but Clara whispered softly, "Just hold her close. She knows you." And then, to Ethan's astonishment, Grace quieted, her small hand curling against his chest. Ethan's shoulders eased, his body learning a rhythm it thought forgotten. His eyes glistened, though he blinked the tears away. Clara watched silently, her heart swelling. This was the window she had been waiting for, the proof that the walls Ethan had built could be reached, if only for moments. When Grace finally drifted to sleep, Ethan laid her gently back in the crib. He lingered, his hand resting on the rail, his expression caught between fear and wonder. Without a word, he left the room, but the silence he left behind was different. Lacey looked up at him, worried and fragile. In the quiet that followed, Clara made her vow once more. She would not only heal the baby's cries, but also restore the father's faith. She had seen his grief, his raw confession to a portrait, his hesitant tenderness. Behind the walls of pride and pain, there was a man who longed for light. And she, though just the nanny, would be the one to show him that the mansion's windows could open again. It began with a whisper. One of the younger maids, tasked with bringing linens to the nursery, arrived a little earlier than usual one morning. She had opened the door quietly, only to find Clara seated in the rocking chair, Grace nestled at her breast. Clara had chosen discretion, draping a blanket over her shoulder, but there was no mistaking what the maid saw. The girl froze, eyes widening, then backed out of the room with a mumbled apology. Clara had barely lifted her gaze before the door clicked shut. She thought little of it at the time. Feeding Grace had become so natural, so instinctive, that the shock of others scarcely crossed her mind anymore. What mattered was the child in her arms, the one who needed comfort more than propriety. But in the corridors of a house that large, secrets seldom stayed hidden. By evening, hushed tones carried across the servants' quarters. By the next morning, the whispers reached the ears of relatives visiting the estate. "The nanny, did you hear?" one aunt murmured. "She nurses the child as if she were her own." The words were soft at first, but like embers fanned by idle tongues, they caught fire. Clara began to feel it in the glances cast her way. Where once there had been polite indifference, now there was scrutiny. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disgust. One of the elder cousins, Eleanor, could hardly contain her disdain. "It's inappropriate," she told a cluster of relatives as Clara passed through the hall. "Ungodly, even. She taking liberties that no servant should." Clara lowered her eyes, her grip on the tray she carried tightening until her knuckles whitened. She wanted to argue, to explain that Grace had needed nourishment when no wet nurse could be found, that it was desperation, not audacity, that had compelled her. But her tongue held still. She was the nanny. They were his blood. The whispers grew louder in the following days. They followed Clara into the kitchen, into the gardens, even into the nursery where she found comfort in Grace's smile. "She's trying to place herself above her station. Perhaps she thinks this is a way to secure her future. A gold digger, hiding behind charity." The words sank like stones into Clara's chest. She had known from the start that stepping into this house would be fraught with danger, that her place here was fragile. Yet she had not anticipated this. Her love for Grace twisted into something sordid by those eager for scandal. One evening, she overheard two staff members speaking in the corridor outside her small room. "Do you think Mr. Sterling knows?" one asked. "Of course he does," the other replied, "but maybe he allows it. Maybe he wants it that way." They laughed, low and cruel. Clara sat on her narrow bed, her hands trembling in her lap. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if she should leave. The thought of abandoning Grace pierced her like a blade, yet what right did she have to drag Ethan's name into disrepute? The whispers were no longer harmless gossip. They were turning into something heavier, something that could stain the Sterling legacy. Her decision nearly came one night, when she walked into the study to find Ethan reviewing documents by the fire. He looked up, the lines of exhaustion still etched into his face. "Mr. Sterling," Clara began softly, "I think it might be best if I step aside." His brow furrowed. "Step aside? Come, become a source of talk in the house. About Grace, about me. It isn't fair to either of you. Perhaps another nanny, someone more proper, would be better." Her voice cracked despite her attempt to steady it. Ethan's eyes narrowed, the storm brewing in them familiar, but this time it wasn't directed at her. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. "Who said this to you?" "One directly," Clara admitted, "but I hear it everywhere, and I know how this must look from the outside." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to cause you trouble." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. His fingers tapped the desk, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You've given my daughter what no one else could. You've given her peace. Anyone who cannot see that is blind." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to believe him, but his reassurance could not drown the voices that haunted every hallway. And she feared that, even if he trusted her, his family would not. Her fears were realized sooner than she expected. The following weekend, Ethan's relatives gathered for a formal dinner in the Great Hall. Clara had no place there, but she passed near enough to hear the conversation through the wide doorway as she carried linens upstairs. The voices were sharp, slicing through the air. "It's indecent, Ethan," Eleanor declared, her tone dripping with outrage. "This girl, this nanny, taking such liberties with your child. You can't be blind to it." "Staff," another cousin chimed in, "staff who seemed far too comfortable. I dare say she's positioning herself for something more. You know how these types are? More. The child, then the fortune." The words struck Clara like physical blows. She froze in the hall, her breath shallow, her eyes burning with shame. Inside, Ethan's voice finally cut through the accusations. "Enough," he said, his tone as sharp as a blade. "You forget yourselves." But the cousins pressed on. "Ethan, people are talking. What if this reaches beyond the house? The name Sterling carries weight. You cannot allow scandal to taint it." Clara backed away, her heart pounding. She wanted to run, to pack her things and leave before Ethan had to suffer further humiliation because of her. Yet she could not take a step without imagining Grace's cries, her tiny hands reaching for comfort that would no longer be there. At night, Clara sat awake in her room, staring at the small suitcase by her bed. Every moment she delayed was another risk to Ethan's reputation. Yet every moment she stayed was another day Grace would wake to familiar arms. Another day the child would know love instead of loss. She closed her eyes, whispering into the silence. What do I choose? What's right for them or for me? The mansion seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer. The answer came sooner than she could imagine. The next evening, Clara found herself summoned, not by Ethan, but by circumstance. A heated argument erupted in the hall as relatives pressed Ethan further, their voices carrying up the staircase. Clara descended halfway, her steps hesitant, her heart pounding, until she could hear them clearly. "It's nothing more than a servant," Eleanor said, her face flushed with indignation, "and yet she dares act as if she were mother to the child. It's unseemly, Ethan. It demeans us all." A chorus of agreement rose from the others. Words like gold digger, shameless, and scheming peppered the conversation. Each one tightened the knot in Clara's stomach. Ethan stood at the center of the storm, his expression hard as granite. "Clara has done nothing but care for my daughter," he said coldly. "Do you call that care?" Eleanor snapped. "She feeds her as though she carried her in her own womb. It's unnatural, Ethan, and what will people think when they learn you allow it? That you welcome such impropriety under your roof?" For a moment, silence fell. Clara, hidden on the staircase, braced herself for the words she feared most. That Ethan would finally agree, that he would dismiss her to protect his family's name. Instead, his voice rang out, firm and unyielding. "I welcome it because Grace is thriving, because for the first time since Evelyn's death, my child sleeps in peace. You call it scandal? I call it salvation." Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor's mouth fell open. "You would risk the family's honor for a servant." "I would risk nothing," Ethan replied, his voice sharp. "It is you who dishonor this house with your cruelty. You see impropriety where there is only devotion. Clara has given more to Grace in weeks than any of you have in your entire lives. That is the truth." Clara gripped the banister, her eyes stinging with tears. She had never expected him to defend her. Not like this. Not with such conviction. The weight of his words filled her with warmth and fear all at once. The relatives faltered, their outrage muted by the steel in Ethan's tone. A few muttered protests, but none dared challenge him further. The matter was settled, at least for now. Clara slipped back upstairs, her heart racing. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that his defense had saved her from breaking. But she also knew that his words marked a turning point, one that could not be ignored. Later that night, as she rocked Grace to sleep, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her in the soft glow of the lamp. Then he stepped inside, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "We won't speak of it again," he said. Clara hesitated, her lips parting. "You didn't have to defend me." "You replied," his gaze steady. "I did." Silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Clara lowered her eyes, stroking Grace's hair. "They'll still think what they want." "Let them," Ethan said, his tone firm. "I know the truth. Grace knows the truth. That's enough." For the first time, Clara saw not just the icy master of the house, but the man beneath. The father, the widower, the soul still raw with grief but unwilling to let his daughter suffer because of it. His defense of her was not simply about loyalty. It was a crack in the walls he had built so carefully, a glimpse of the humanity he could no longer deny. As he turned to leave, Clara whispered, "Thank you." Ethan paused at the door, his shoulders tense. "Don't thank me, Clara. Just keep doing what you've been doing. Keep giving her what I can't." And then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the hall. Clara sat in the quiet, Grace warm in her arms, her heart heavy yet lifted. The whispers would not stop, not truly, but she now knew she was not alone in bearing them. Ethan had stood beside her, publicly, undeniably, and that changed everything. She pressed a kiss to Grace's forehead, whispering, "We'll be all right, little one, we will." In that moment, Clara felt the mansion shift again, not in its walls or its windows, but in its heart. For the first time, Ethan had chosen her side, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, the whisper of scandal had become the whisper of something else entirely. The beginning of trust. The storm rattled against the mansion windows that night, a relentless rhythm that mirrored Ethan's restless pacing. Grace's cries pierced through the halls, sharper and more desperate than usual. Clara rushed into the nursery, her heart pounding when she saw the baby flushed and burning with fever. "She's burning up," Clara whispered, pressing the back of her hand against Grace's tiny forehead. Ethan appeared behind her, his face pale and stricken. For a moment, he seemed frozen, the mask of control that always cloaked him slipping away. What do we do?" he stammered, panic edging his voice. Clara didn't hesitate. She scooped Grace into her arms and cradled her close. "Cool cloths. Keep her hydrated. She needs comfort more than anything." Her tone was steady, even though her heart was racing. Together they moved through the night. Ethan fetched water, towels, medicine. Clara sat rocking Grace, humming softly, wiping her damp forehead while whispering gentle reassurances. Each time the baby whimpered, Ethan flinched, as though he were being cut open by the sound. Hours blurred. The nursery became a world of shadows, whispers, and shared resolve. Clara saw Ethan kneel beside her chair, one hand hovering over Grace's small fist, afraid to touch, yet desperate to protect. His eyes glistened in the dim lamplight. "She looks so much like her mother," he murmured, his voice raw, almost breaking. "And every time she cries like this, I hear her last moments. I hear the silence after they told me she was gone." Clara's heart ached. She had seen glimpses of his grief before, but never so unguarded, never so fractured. For once, Ethan wasn't the impenetrable millionaire, but simply a father terrified of losing the last piece of his wife. "You've carried that pain alone for too long," Clara whispered. "But Grace doesn't need a man frozen by the past. She needs her father, here, now." Ethan looked at her then, truly looked, as though hearing a truth he had been too afraid to face. His jaw tightened, his shoulders shook, and in the silence that followed, Clara felt the walls between them shift. The fever slowly began to break by dawn, Grace's breathing softening into the rhythm of sleep. Clara laid her gently back into the crib, smoothing the blankets over her small chest. Ethan stood nearby, exhaustion etched across his features, yet something in his eyes had changed. Something. He knew exactly what to do, he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the long night. "You didn't panic. You didn't fail her." Clara glanced at him, her fingers brushing Grace's curls. "I've seen sickness before," she admitted, her tone hushed, confessional. "When I was little, my baby brother got sick. We couldn't afford medicine, not even the cheapest kind. I watched him fade away in my mother's arms. I promised myself I would never stand by helplessly again." Her words hung in the stillness, heavy with remembered loss. Ethan's expression faltered, his gaze falling to the crib, then back to her. He thought, "I was the only one who knew that kind of helplessness," he said. "Losing Emma, I built these walls because I couldn't bear the thought of watching Grace slip through my fingers too." His hand pressed against the crib rail as if anchoring himself. "But tonight, you stood where I couldn't. You saved her." Clara shook her head, her eyes shining with emotion. "We saved her, together." The words seemed to pierce deeper than she intended. Ethan's breath caught, and for the first time, gratitude and something unspoken softened his features. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was a quiet recognition of the bond forming between them, a bond he had tried to deny. The first rays of dawn filtered through the nursery curtains, painting the room in a warm glow. Ethan looked at Clara as though seeing her differently, not merely as the nanny, not merely as a caretaker, but as the woman who had stepped into the cracks of his broken world and held it together when he couldn't. Clara didn't say more, but inside she made a silent vow. She would keep bringing light into this house, no matter how heavy the shadows. And as Ethan turned back to watch his daughter sleep peacefully, the silence between them wasn't cold or distant anymore. It was filled with something new. An understanding, fragile yet undeniable, that their lives were beginning to intertwine. The morning paper lay on the grand dining table, its headlines screaming louder than the polished silverware and untouched plates. A grainy photograph splashed across the front page showed Clara cradling Grace in her arms as they walked through the park. Grace's little face peeked out from beneath a blanket, while Clara's gaze was soft, protective. To anyone else, it was a tender picture of a nanny with a child. To the world of ruthless society pages, it was scandal fuel. Who let this happen? Ethan's voice was a growl, low and dangerous. He slammed the newspaper down, his relatives gathered around like vultures. She was seen in public, feeding, walking my daughter as though she were her own. Do you know what they're calling her now? The woman who replaced Emma. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, having just entered with Grace. The whispers around the table stabbed like knives. It's inappropriate, muttered one relative. It's unseemly, said another. She's young, pretty, clearly she knows what she's doing. Climbing her way into his... The gossip didn't stop there. By afternoon, Ethan's office phone rang endlessly. His business partners called, their voices sharp with concern. Ethan, this woman is becoming a liability. Your image is everything. Investors are worried. They think you've lost judgment, letting a servant play the role of mother. Ethan clenched his fists, torn between rage and despair. He knew Grace had never thrived like this before Clara arrived, yet the weight of expectation pressed down like iron chains. Clara saw it in his eyes, the torment of a man pulled between two worlds. That evening, while the mansion slept, Clara sat at her small desk and poured her heart into a letter. Her hands trembled as she wrote, "For Grace, you are everything. She needs you more than she will ever need me, but I cannot be the cause of your ruin. Every whisper cuts you deeper, and I cannot watch your world collapse because of me. I will love her always, from afar." When she folded the note and placed it atop her neatly made bed, tears blurred her vision. She packed her few belongings in silence, each item a reminder of the joy she was leaving behind. Clara carried her bag down the back staircase, her steps soundless against the polished wood. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves mourned her leaving. She reached for the side door, hoping to slip away before dawn, but a figure stepped out of the shadows. "Where are you going?" Ethan's voice was sharp, laced with something between fury and desperation. He held the letter in his hand, crumpled, as though he couldn't bear to read it again. Clara froze, clutching her bag tighter. "I can't stay. You've seen the papers, the calls. They'll destroy you because of me." "I don't care about them," Ethan snapped, taking a step closer. "What I care about is that you're trying to walk away from Grace, from me, without even letting me fight for you." His voice cracked, revealing the storm inside him. "Do you think I can survive losing someone again?" Clara shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "This isn't about you, Ethan. It's about Grace. She deserves a world without shame, without people whispering about who her father chose to let into her life." For a long moment they stood there, words like weapons between them. Then a small sound cut through the tension. Grace's cry drifted down the hall. Both turned, instinct pulling them together. Clara dropped her bag and rushed to the nursery, Ethan right behind her. Grace stood in her crib, clutching the bars, her cheeks flushed with sleep. When she saw Clara, her tiny arms stretched out, trembling with urgency. And then, in a voice small yet clear, she said it. Word shattered the silence, echoing in the room with undeniable truth. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Ethan froze, his chest heaving, eyes wide with shock. Grace repeated it, softer but certain. "Mama." Ethan looked at Clara, the weight of every doubt crumbling in that instant. His daughter had spoken, and the word she chose was the one no scandal, no whisper, no headline could erase. Grace had chosen her truth, and in it, Ethan saw his own. Clara gathered Grace into her arms, pressing her close. Ethan stepped forward, his voice breaking. "You can't leave." You are her mother in every way that matters, and I can't lose either of you." The nursery was still thick with the echo of Grace's first word. Clara held the little girl against her chest, rocking her gently, as if the moment itself were too fragile to breathe on. Ethan stood by the crib, his tall frame shadowing the soft lamplight, his gaze fixed on Clara as though seeing her for the first time. He spent years building a fortress around his grief, brick by brick, stone by stone. Since Emma's death, nothing and no one had been allowed through. But here, in this quiet room where Grace had spoken Mama for the first time, those walls had cracked. It wasn't scandal or gossip that undid him. It wasn't the newspapers or the accusations. It was the sound of his daughter's voice, the truth it carried, and the way Clara's arms seemed to complete a circle around the child they both loved. Clara finally set Grace back down, pulling the blanket around her small body. The baby sighed, already drifting back to sleep, content in the comfort of knowing her world was safe. Clara lingered by the crib, her hand brushing against Grace's hair before she stepped back. She stood still, calling herself desperately, though her voice was unsteady. Peyton felt a surge of Satan. They will never stop talking. And you deserve a life without whispers. Ethan moved closer, his expression fierce yet vulnerable. Stop thinking about them. For once in your life, Clara, stop thinking about everyone else and listen to me. His eyes flicked up, meeting his. What is it you want me to hear? You've given me back my daughter, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Before you came, Grace barely smiled. She barely looked at me. I thought I'd lost her to grief, the same way I lost Emma. But you've brought her back to life. Her laughter, her warmth, her first word, it's because of you, and not just her. You've given me back something I thought I buried with Emma. My heart. Clara's breath caught. She stumbled back, shaking her head. Don't say that. You don't mean it. You're not just anything, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. You're not just a nanny. You're not just someone filling a role. You're the reason this house doesn't feel like a tomb anymore. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she bit her lip and turned away, refusing to let them fall. You don't understand, Ethan. I can't compete with her. With Emma. She was your wife, your perfect love, and Her voice broke, and I almost believed the woman who stepped into a place that was never mine to claim. Silence hung between them, sharp and suffocating. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes storming with emotions he had tried to bury for too long. He stepped forward and caught her wrist, gently but firmly, turning her to face him. You think you're competing with her? He asked, his voice low. You think I'd ever let that happen? Emma will always be part of me. But you, Clara, you're not taking her place. You're building something new with me, something I never thought I'd have again. Clara trembled, searching his face for doubt, but all she found was raw sincerity. Still, fear gnawed at her. And what if I can't give you enough? What if tomorrow you regret this, and I'm left holding nothing but broken pieces? Ethan shook his head, his eyes dark with certainty. I have already lived with broken pieces. I have already known what it feels like to lose everything. Regret isn't possible, Clara. Not with every breath you take reminds me that life can begin. Her tears spilled then, hot and unstoppable. She pulled her wrist free and pressed her hands against her face, unable to contain the flood of emotions crashing through her. Ethan stood still, watching her unravel, fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. He knew she needed space, yet every fiber of him longed to bridge the distance. Finally, Clara dropped her hands, her eyes red but blazing with defiance. Then prove it, she whispered. Prove to me that I'm not just a shadow in your life. Prove that this isn't just grief speaking. Ethan's breath came heavy, his chest rising and falling as though he'd been running. He stepped forward, closer and closer, until only inches separated them. His voice dropped to a murmur. Come with me. Clara blinked, confused. Where? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand and guided her out of the nursery. Down the hall they went, past the portraits of ancestors and memories, past the cold marble that had once made the mansion feel like a mausoleum. He led her up a narrow staircase that wound toward the rooftop terrace. The sky outside had opened into rain, sheets of it falling against the glass windows. When Ethan pushed open the terrace door, the storm greeted them with a rush of cool wind and heavy drops. Clara gasped, stepping out into the downpour, her hair plastering instantly to her cheeks. "Biff," she cried over the roar of rain. "What are we doing here?" His eyes locked onto hers, burning through the darkness and the storm. "I need you to understand," he shouted back, water dripping down his face. "This isn't about replacing Emma. This is about me choosing you. This is about Grace choosing you. This is about us choosing something new, even if the world Clara's lips parted, her heart pounding louder than the thunder. "And what, if I'm too afraid to choose it?" Ethan moved closer, rain soaking through his shirt, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Then I'll wait," he said, softer now. "I'll wait as long as it takes, but I need you to know this. I love you, Clara, not because you care for Grace, not because you filled an empty space, but because you've become the center of every breath I take." The words hit her harder than the rain. She stood there, trembling, caught between fear and the fierce pull of something she had denied too long. "You've eluded cover," she whispered. The storm raged around them, but for a moment the only sound was the thundering of their hearts. Clara's chest heaved as she fought the tide of emotions Ethan's words unleashed. The rooftop was a blur of rain and lightning, yet his confession cut through it all with piercing clarity. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, not just from the storm, but from the weight of what he had given her. "You can't just say that," she cried, her voice trembling. "You can't just tell me you love me and expect everything to be different. Your life is filled with shadows, Ethan, with expectations, with people waiting for you to fail. And me, I'm just the woman they'll always call an intruder." Ethan shook his head fiercely, water dripping from his jaw. "You're not an intruder, Clara. You're the light that dragged me out of those shadows. For years I lived half alive, convincing myself that grief was the only thing I deserved. But you and Grace, you've proven me wrong. I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live, and I want to live with you." Clara's throat tightened, her tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Ethan closed the distance between them, his hand lifting to gently cup her face. "You've been stronger than me from the moment you walked into this house. You carried Grace when I couldn't. You held her when she cried, fed her when she needed comfort, loved her when I was too broken to try. Don't tell me you're not strong enough. Clara, you're the strongest person I've ever known." Her breath hitched, her lips parting under the intensity of his gaze. His thumb brushed across her cheek, slow and reverent, as though he were memorizing the shape of her. "Let me love you," he whispered. "Not in Emma's shadow, but in the light we can build together." The words shattered the last of Clara's defenses. She let out a sob, her hands trembling as she reached up to grasp his wrist. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Ethan leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Then don't," he murmured. "Let this be the beginning." For a long, suspended moment, neither moved. The storm roared around them, thunder rolling like a drumbeat, rain pelting their faces and soaking their clothes. And then, slowly, Clara closed her eyes. When Ethan's lips met hers, the world seemed to fall silent. The kiss was not tentative or questioning, it was a collision of years of pain, longing, and love unspoken. His hand slid to the back of her neck, holding her as though she were the only anchor he had left. Clara melted into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might break free. The kiss deepened, rain washing away everything else, the gossip, the fear, the years of silence. It was fierce, desperate, but also tender, filled with the promise of something neither had thought possible. Again, when they finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Ethan pressed his... "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice raw. "Not because I need you, but because I choose you." Clara's lips curved into a trembling smile, tears mingling with raindrops. "And I choose you." For the first time in years, Ethan laughed. A broken, beautiful laugh that sounded like freedom. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, as though the storm itself could never tear them apart. They stayed that way until the rain softened into a gentle drizzle, the storm retreating into distant grumbles. When they finally stepped back inside, dripping and shivering, something between them had changed forever. The house, once filled with echoes of sorrow, now hummed with a different kind of silence. one filled with possibility, with love, with a future that neither had dared to imagine. Clara glanced toward the nursery, where Grace slept peacefully, unaware of the vow that had just been sealed beneath the storm. Ethan followed her gaze and smiled faintly. She spoke her truth, Clara. Tonight I spoke mine. And tomorrow? He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Tomorrow, we build something new. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes soft but steady. For the first time, she believed it might be true. The air in the Blackwell estate felt different now, lighter, as though the heavy curtains of grief had finally been drawn back. The once silent halls carried the sound of soft footsteps and innocent giggles. In the garden, the roses that had long gone untended now thrived again, their petals unfolding under the warm sun. Grace toddled forward on chubby legs, her tiny hand nestled in Clara's, her laughter ringing out like a melody. Clara bent low, encouraging every unsteady step with patience and warmth, her smile radiant as she watched the little girl wobble forward with determination. A few steps behind them, Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. The man who had once walked the corridors of his home like a ghost now seemed alive again, his eyes fixed on his daughter and the woman who had changed everything. Clara turned her head slightly, and their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no distance in that glance, no wall of coldness or restraint. Instead, it was filled with something that spoke louder than words: trust, gratitude, and love. Grace stumbled forward suddenly, her little feet tangling on the grass. Clara caught her in time, scooping her up with practiced ease. The baby squealed, clinging to Clara's neck, her dark curls brushing against Clara's cheek. "You're safe," Clara whispered softly, planting a kiss on Grace's forehead. Ethan approached then, his gaze softened. "Stronger every day," he said quietly, reaching out to stroke his daughter's hair. Grace squirmed in Clara's arms, reaching toward her father, and Ethan lifted her gently, resting her against his chest. Clara watched them together, her heart tugging with a warmth that surprised her still. Once, Ethan had seemed unreachable, his grief like a fortress no one could enter. But now, as he held Grace with tenderness, as his eyes softened every time they landed on Clara, that fortress had begun to crumble. As they walked back toward the mansion, Ethan noticed the way Clara's hand brushed over Grace's back absent-mindedly, protective and natural, as though she had always belonged in their world. The sight stirred something deep within him, something he had long buried under guilt and fear. He remembered nights when he had stood alone in the nursery, listening to his daughter's cries and feeling powerless. He remembered the weight of his late wife's absence, the crushing fear that he would never be enough. And then, he remembered Clara, her courage, her defiance, her endless tenderness. Inside the mansion, the dining hall glowed with evening light. The long table, once a symbol of formality and emptiness, now held plates set for three. Clara had resisted at first, insisting she would eat in the kitchen, as she always had, but Ethan had been firm. "No more divisions," he had said. "Not in this house." That night, as they sat together, the family they had unknowingly built felt undeniable. Grace babbled happily between spoonfuls, occasionally smearing food across her cheeks, and Clara laughed softly as she wiped her face. Ethan watched them both, a rare ease in his posture. But beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. His heart was no longer his own. It belonged to the woman across from him, the one who had brought back his daughter's laughter and, unknowingly, his own hope. He had rehearsed the words countless times in his mind, but still, the weight of what he wanted to do left his palms damp. Ethan Blackwell, the man whose empire could bend under his command, found himself trembling at the thought of a single question. Later that evening, Clara tucked Grace into her crib, humming softly, until the child drifted into sleep. Ethan lingered at the doorway, watching. He had come to love that sight, the way Clara leaned over the crib, her hand lingering on Grace's tiny chest to feel the rhythm of her breaths, her voice low and gentle, as though protection no one else could give. When she finally turned, she startled to see Ethan standing there. "You're quiet," she said softly. He replied, his voice lower than usual. "About how much has changed since the day you walked through these doors?" Clara lowered her gaze, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I should thank you for letting me stay, even when everything was complicated." "You saved us both," Ethan said firmly. "I thought I'd lost everything, and then you gave me back my daughter, You gave me back myself." Clara's breath caught, but she said nothing, her heart pounding in her chest. She feared what he might say next, feared that if he spoke too directly, she would crumble under the weight of her own feelings. The following morning, the garden was alive with the scent of rain. Clouds hung heavy overhead, and a breeze stirred the roses. Clara stood near the fountain with Grace toddling at her side, her hands ready to catch her at any moment. Ethan approached slowly, his steps deliberate, a small velvet box hidden inside his coat. He had waited for the right moment, and now, as he saw his daughter's small fingers curled tightly around Clara's, he knew it had come. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. She turned, and the sight of his expression stilled her breath. Grace giggled, tugging at Clara's hand, and Ethan knelt suddenly, not just before Clara, but before them both. Grace squealed in delight, thinking it a game, and reached her tiny hands toward her father's. Clara's eyes widened as Ethan pulled the small box from his coat and opened it, revealing a ring that shimmered even under the muted light. But it wasn't the diamond that caught her breath. It was the way his voice trembled when he spoke. "I spent years believing I had to protect Grace alone, that my grief meant I could never let anyone close again," Ethan said. "But you proved me wrong. You brought her laughter back. You brought me back. Clara Morales, I'm not asking you only to marry me. I'm asking you to be Grace's mother in every way she already sees you as." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, her lips parting but no words forming. Grace babbled happily, reaching up at the moment as if echoing her father's plea. Clara sank to her knees instinctively, her arms wrapping around both of them. Her tears fell against Ethan's shoulder as she whispered, "Yes, yes, I will." Grace giggled, as though she understood, pressing her small hands against Clara's face. Then, as if fate itself had waited for this moment, she formed the word clearly, her first with meaning and joy. Clara froze, her heart lurching. Ethan's breath caught audibly. They both looked at Grace, who repeated it again, her eyes shining as she reached for Clara. "Mama." The word broke something inside Clara, flooding her with emotions too vast to contain. She cradled Grace tightly, sobbing into her hair. Ethan's hand slid across her back, steadying her as tears filled his own eyes. For the first time, the weight of grief was replaced not by fear, but by the certainty of love, a future worth holding. The days that followed were touched with a golden warmth that the Blackwell estate had not felt in years. News of Ethan's engagement spread quickly among his circle, but unlike the scandals of before, this time there was no venom that could pierce the truth. The man who had been accused of coldness, of locking himself away from the world, now walked openly with Clara and Grace by his side. The staff whispered in relief, the halls thrummed with renewed life, and the gardens seemed to bloom brighter, as if nature itself celebrated the change. Clara moved through the mansion with a quiet confidence, no longer the hired help who ate her meals in the kitchen. She belonged here now, not just in duty, but in heart. Grace toddled after her at every turn, calling out, "Mama," with unstrained joy, a word that never failed to draw tears to Clara's eyes. Ethan, too, carried himself differently. Where once his shoulders were weighed down with sorrow, they now held pride, softened by the gentle warmth he reserved for his. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Ethan led Clara to the terrace overlooking the gardens. Grace had fallen asleep earlier than usual, leaving them a rare moment of quiet together. Ethan poured 2 glasses of wine, his gaze lingering on Clara as she leaned against the railing, her hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "You've changed everything," he said softly. Clara turned, her brow furrowed slightly. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." "You did more than you know," he countered. "You gave me back hope, and you gave Grace what I never thought she'd have again, a mother's love." Her chest tightened at his words, her throat thick with unspoken emotion. "Ethan," she whispered, "I was so afraid I would never belong here, that I was only filling a space that should have belonged to someone else." Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing gently against her cheek. "You are not filling a space, Clara. You created one that never existed before. You aren't replacing my wife. You are building something new with me, something Grace and I never would have found without you." The sincerity in his voice unraveled her doubts. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as his lips met hers in a kiss that was tender, deliberate, and filled with promise. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that love had chosen her, that her presence was not a temporary act of kindness but a permanent part of their lives. Weeks later, the garden became the setting for their intimate wedding. Ethan chose not the grandeur of society's expectations, but the simplicity of the place where their bond had truly begun. Among the roses, under the open sky, with Grace at the center. Clara walked down the makeshift aisle in a modest gown, her hands trembling as Grace toddled ahead of her, scattering petals, a sight that drew smiles and tears from everyone present. When Ethan took Clara's hand, the world seemed to fall silent. His vows were not rehearsed, but spoken from the rawest part of his heart. All the wealth in the world could never compare to what you have given me. You gave me back my daughter's laughter, my own smile, and a love I thought I had lost forever. I vow to spend the rest of my life proving that I see you, Clara, not as a savior, not as a stand-in, but as the woman I loved, the mother of our family. Clara's own voice shook as she replied, I came here with nothing but hope, unsure if I could make a difference. But you and Grace gave me more than I ever imagined. You gave me a home, a family, and a love that feels like destiny. I vow to stand by you both, through every storm and every sunrise. When they kissed, Grace clapped her tiny hands and shouted "Mama," as though sealing the union herself. The guests laughed and cheered, and Ethan swept both Clara and Grace into his arms, holding them close as though nothing in the world could ever tear them apart again. In the quiet that followed the celebrations, Clara sat with Grace in the nursery, rocking her gently as she drifted to sleep. Ethan entered silently, watching as Clara hummed a lullaby, her voice tender, her expression radiant. He knelt beside them, his hand covering those Clara's and Grace's. I used to believe money could fix everything, he admitted softly. But I learned that wealth is nothing without love. What you've given me is something no empire, no fortune could ever buy. Clara looked at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. And what you gave me, she whispered, was the chance to be part of a family again. Grace stirred slightly, murmuring, "Mama," in her sleep, and both Ethan and Clara smiled through their tears. They sat together in the glow of the nursery lamp, the three of them bound, not by obligation, but by love that had survived grief, scandal, and fear. The Blackwell mansion, once cloaked in silence, now held the sound of new beginnings. And as Ethan and Clara shared one last kiss before the night deepened, it was clear that the story of sorrow had ended, and the story of a family reborn had truly begun.